More than 9 in 10 Singaporeans and permanent residents are concerned about climate change. That's according to a survey by Mediacorp. And most say that they will do their part to minimize its impact.
But respondents were divided when asked how to fund the fight. 53% indicated that current or future taxes should be used, while the rest said the national reserves should be used.
96% agreed that the government must do more to minimize the effects of climate change. Just over 1,000 people aged 18 and above took part in the online poll last month. It was conducted after Environment and Water Resources Minister Masagos Zulkifli said tackling climate change was a pressing priority.
Now for more on this, we're joined by Dr. Shawn Lum, a senior lecturer at NTU's Asian School of Environment and president of the Nature Society Singapore. Shawn, great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Steve. Don.
Now, firstly, we've seen perceptions surrounding climate change over the last decade, a wider acceptance that it is something we legitimately should be concerned about. How is that translated, though, from awareness into action?
I think it's an important first step. I mean, if you think of how narrow that window for action is, we really need to be changing the way we view this issue and the urgency with which we need to deal with it. As you mentioned, the challenge is how do we get the action to keep up with the awareness? And I think there are many things that we can do. And you see people of all walks of life, all ages, trying to do something. It's now how can we take the next step and really empower people at different levels to do what we need to do, both as a country as well as part of the global community, to really make sure that we can keep that temperature rise below 1.5 degrees.
Shawn, so-called climate apathy has been cited as one of the reasons, behind why people don't take action. They might think that, they don't want to change what they do, how they make choices. They don't want to consciously consume things. How big of an issue is that?
I think it is a big issue. But, like many things, I mean, if you go to, just look at our lifestyle or people in other parts of Asia, to imagine that we would be, have the degree of, say, cleanliness, recycling, a lot of the things, water sanitation, things that we take for granted today, just as part of everyday life, would have maybe be considered a dream even a generation ago. So I think I see climate-related, behavioral change, attitudinal change. I think this is all quite achievable. And yes, there is some apathy in some sectors of society, but I think once you start, it's just the first step might be the hardest, and then you gradually absorb that and just becomes a way of life. And I'm not only convinced it can happen, it really has to happen. We really face some not very, we face a pretty grim future otherwise.
Yeah, the alternative is not one that bears thinking about. Respondents of the survey, though, were almost unanimous in wanting the government to do more to minimize the impact of climate change. What do you think the government could do more of? I mean, policy seems to be where it could perhaps have the greatest impact on companies setting up here, perhaps in their sort of emissions when it comes to sort of industrial sort of industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing it in different ways. One would be obviously how do we physically buffer ourselves against say sea level rise, which we're doing in terms of how we do, for example, land reclamation, and we've increased that buffer. So that's the physical aspect, the infrastructure. And then, as you say, policy and things like, for example, the Singapore, the stock exchange is encouraging companies to be more transparent in terms of their environmental record and things like that. And that's gonna spread. But again, the government can do a lot, and they are doing. And we see people, regular people, academics, people in industry doing so much. I guess the question is, let's go beyond the government. What can we do as individuals, institutions, collectively to do more, not just for here, but for the region?
Increasingly, investors are beginning to select companies or invest in companies that they know are doing things more sustainably. So that is certainly a positive thing for change. But let's look at what Singapore's agreed to here for 2030 under the Paris Climate Agreement. We've agreed to reduce both emissions and emissions intensity by certain proportions. How far along are we on that?
Okay, well, Singapore as a country will be hard-pressed to reach these global targets, not because we're not trying, but because we're urban. We're a city without a hinterland. We have maybe limited resources and ability to generate power, for example. So globally, the target is to reduce emissions by 45%, almost half by 2030. That's 12 years. 12 years. You'll still be working here in 12 years, maybe. And by 2050, which is really just around the corner, we have to go net zero carbon. Now, for Singapore, for any city to do that would be very difficult. But then if you think in terms of a wider landscape, I think we can do what we need to both here and then also contribute to the region to hit those targets. You know, we have financial sector, education, media, we have researchers. We can innovate, and these innovations and policy should go beyond Singapore. I mean, we've got this talent. Let's harness it and use it for good globally. I know we can do it.
Well, the progress certainly has to move forward, and we can hopefully do all of this together. Shawn, thank you very much for coming into the studios to talk to us about Singaporeans' attitudes towards climate change and the changes that we hope to see. We've been joined there by Dr. Shawn Lum, Senior Lecturer at NTU's Asian School of the Environment and also President of the Nature Society of Singapore.